And now on to Volume 3 of the Buddha series by Osamu Tezuka. If you missed my review of Volumes 1 and Volume 2, I'll link to them in the description down below, but for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to jump right in and talk about Volume 3. So it's another day, and I finished off another volume of this manga series. I've been making good progress on this series, although that will slow down the day after tomorrow when my wife and kids come back from my wife's parents' house where they've been up for the past week. But for the moment, at least, I'm continuing on through this series, and then expect the pace of these videos to slow down after tomorrow. So yeah, volume 3. I'm going to try my best to avoid repeating things that I've already said ad nauseum in the first couple videos, because a lot of those things are going to be the same. Except I just can't. A lot of those things are the same, and so I guess I just can't resist highlighting a little bit what I continue to find a little bit weird about Tezuka Osamu's work. And this, as I mentioned in the previous couple of videos, this is stuff that struck me 20 years ago when I was living in Japan and I was absorbing a lot of his manga. And it's stuff that I kind of forgotten about, but boy oh boy is this series bringing it back. And that is the weird tonal dissonance between the very cartoon style and the really dark places it will go to. And when I say cartoon style, I mean like, this kind of Disney-esque cartoon style animation. But, the classic example here is Devadatta, who's a very young kid here. I don't know, they're portrayed as being 5 years old, going off with a bunch of other 5-year-olds. And there's all these kind of cutesy little cartoonish type antics going on. But then stuff will take a dark turn out of nowhere. So they're in this cave, and he ends up murdering the other 5-year-olds with this rock. And then yeah, it goes from really cutesy to really dark just at the turn of the hat, all throughout this series. So he gets sentenced to death to be torn up by the wild beast, which is really dark. Then it turns out these are his animal friends, which is really cutesy. And then it gets dark again and cutesy again, and all throughout. And again, I mentioned this in the first couple of videos, but I'm reminded of why I think I had a hard time really sticking with Tezuka Osamu's comics for a long time. Where I bought loads of his comic books when I lived in Japan. But I would seldom read them cover to cover. I would just kind of flip through them and then go on to the next one. Like I said in my first video, manga was very cheap in Japan. Okay. Yeah. Speaking of buying stuff in Japan, the other thing that I'm noticing as I'm reading through this. So, yeah, I think I'm reminded that although Tezuka Osamu was not hard to find in Japan, even though he was old, even when I was living in Japan, and I was living in Japan 20 years ago, because he had his heyday in the 1960s and 1970s. But his stuff was still widely available everywhere. But this Buddha series, as I mentioned in my first video, I mentioned this, but I think maybe I didn't emphasize this enough. I stumbled upon his Buddha series when I was in a used bookstore and found this box set of it. And it strikes me now that that was significant because up until then I didn't even know it existed. And again, this was before the days of Wikipedia. So it was not it did not strike me as being a particularly popular series of his in Japan. It was one of his also rans or one of his obscurities or one of his lesser known works. Whereas in English translation, I think it's this series has been very popular, and is probably one of the series maybe he's better known for in the English translation. Now, as always, take my opinion with a grain of salt because that's just my impression based on my own experiences. But I think this series has been very popular in English translation because there are a million people just like me who are curious about the mythology behind Buddhism. Not looking to convert necessarily, but just curious what the stories are, what the mythology is, and really don't know anything at all about it. So a comic book seems like a very interesting way to learn about it. But as I'm reading this and as I'm checking up on Wikipedia to look at the actual mythology behind a lot of these characters, I'm beginning to realize that this is. I'm beginning to realize more and more that this is largely just an invented story by Osamu Tezuka. I don't know. I mean, let me know in the comments if you happen to know more about this. But there for example, the volume 3 is subtitled Devadatta, which is this character here, who is actually part of the original Buddhist mythology, according to Wikipedia. Apparently, the impression I get is that he's somewhat like the Judas of the Buddhist mythology. He was a disciple of Buddha who later turned against him and tried to kill him. And so the bulk of, this character was born in Volume 2, but the bulk of Volume 3 is describing his childhood and his upbringing. And there's this story about how he's in the cave and he killed the other children, and then he gets raised by beasts, and then he goes and finds the monk who was one of the main characters in Volume 1, who's living like a wild man. And then he just has a ridiculous story. He goes into town and he gets recruited into this strange scheme to poison the wife of the rich man. And he's got this big old long story arc. And as far as I can tell from Wikipedia, and that is very much the limit of my knowledge, none of this seems to have any basis at all in the original myth. This is just all stuff Tezuka Osamu is making up. Now, I guess with historical fiction, the idea is you are supposed to fill in the gaps in the historical record, or in this case in the mythical record, with your own inventions to flesh out these characters. So maybe that's fair enough, but I guess I'm realizing more and more just how much of this is just complete fiction. And then I think there are things that contradict the Buddhist mythology. So, for example, there's this character here. What was her name again? There's this ruler of the land. Yes, her name is Visakha. And again, according to Wikipedia, she actually is part of the original Buddhist mythology. She was a ruler who was one of his patrons. But this whole story in the comic about how she falls in love with him and then she drugs him because she's so in love with him, and then the bandits sack the city, and Buddha has to save her life. Again, not only is this not apparently in the original mythology, certainly no mention of this in Wikipedia, but I mean, according to Wikipedia, she first met Buddha when she was 7, and no mention of her falling in love with him. So I think what Tezuka Osamu is doing here is taking some of the ideas or themes from Buddhist mythology, but just largely recreating his separate story, which is not meant to be a faithful representation of the original myth, which in retrospect, I really should have seen coming. Because, I think that's what he does. He's not a scholar, and he's not big into historical fiction, and every adaptation that he does, which I had been aware of, he does take significant liberties with it. But for some reason, I just thought, I don't know. I just got caught up in the fancy packaging of this and thought this was more of an authentic thing into the myth. Although, as always, when you read something like this, it's interesting. When this first came out in the 1970s and early 80s, if I had read it then, I really would have been none the wiser. But it's a wonderful age we live in, because we live in the age of Wikipedia, where you can research this while you read it. And by researching it on Wikipedia, I guess I am getting an education after all. Now, I suppose you might say, well, why not just go to Wikipedia? Why read the comic book? But my on Wikipedia, it's a little bit confusing. The Wikipedia entries are encyclopedia entries. There's a lot of stuff about like the sources and the origins of these myths, and then there are the different conflicting versions of the myth, and I just can't absorb it. This is a little bit embarrassing to admit, because I've always considered myself a history nerd, but I've always absorbed history better through historical fiction, where I can get into the story and then I supplement that with the fact checking on Wikipedia. So yeah, what else is going on in here? So yeah, as this volume is titled Devadatta, it's, I don't know, close to half the story about Devadatta's childhood, all of which I don't think is any relation to the real myth. And then Buddha is continuing his traveling. He's traveling with this ascetic monk who was introduced in the previous volume. I think, if you want to nitpick this, I think I am noticing some contradictions. The ascetic monk has a philosophy that enlightenment is reached through suffering, or something is reached through suffering. There's some sort of spiritual benefit to enduring suffering. So he goes through various ideals where he tortures the body. And Buddha is against this. Actually, yeah, maybe I might make a couple nitpicks here. I guess hopefully we'll see more of Buddha's philosophy develop as the manga progresses. But one thing that I maybe am not so wild about is the Buddha here seems to make a lot of pronouncements. So it says, to die is an ordeal in pure greatness. It is the supreme idea. Why disagree? Dying doesn't solve a thing. It can't be the answer. You see, I don't want to die. Or are you telling me that life doesn't matter? And it, okay, it's something, but it would be nice to see what experiences led Buddha to these ideas instead of like the Buddha just spouting out these ideas like he was born with them. Sorry, I shouldn't be calling him the Buddha yet. He's still Siddhartha at this point in the story. But the other thing is, having set this up, that this monk believes in, the whole suffering brings character thing. Then for the whole rest of the story, this monk is the one who's advocating for the easy way out every time, and Buddha is always the one who's advocating to do the right thing. So I don't know if that's, maybe that's intentional, if I'm being generous. Maybe that was supposed to be the contradiction built into his character. I felt like it was just a contradiction. They also acquire a young child who gets fobbed on him by his father, who they're supposed to train up as a monk. Where is he? Yeah, over here. Who's got a bandage on his forehead, which I'm pretty sure is meant to be covering up his third eye, because the child with three eyes is one of the reoccurring characters in Tezuka Osamu's comics, and this gets back into talking about Tezuka Osamu's body of work generally, but he had various characters who would make appearances across a wide variety of stories. It would be, it wasn't the same character every time, obviously, because there was no continuity between his stories. But I guess you would call it like incarnations of that character. And the kid with three eyes is one of them here. Three eyes is apparently the third eye is supposed to be something very symbolic in Buddhism. Now that character is not from the historical record either, apparently. I believe. And then but he gets the. Sorry, when I say historical record, I always mean the original myth. I don't believe any of this is historical, but I am interested in what goes back to the older mythology. Sorry, I misspoke again. Some of it may be historical. I don't. It's possible that there was a historical Buddha that the myth was built around. It's not my area of expertise. But then this character here, some sort of ruler. What was his name again? Yeah. Bimbisara. And the child with the three eyes who's given the gift of prophecy prophesies to him that he will be slain by his own son. And this part checks out on Wikipedia as going back to the original mythology. So this was another one of Buddha's patrons who I guess was killed by his own son at one point. Now, at this point in the story, his own son isn't even born. And I don't think, as far as I know, the prophecy that he was going to get killed by his own son was not part of the original mythology, but he does end up getting killed by his own son in the original mythology. So some stuff apparently lines up with the original mythology, so I do feel like I'm learning some stuff. Although I also find, now that I'm middle-aged, I don't remember stuff long-term as well as I used to. Like, when I was in middle school or high school, if I read a book and it made an impression on me, I would remember those characters for like the rest of my life. Remember the history lessons I got in seventh grade like very well. But I feel like now that I'm in my 40s, I read a history book and then, a couple years later, I don't really remember it in any great detail. So we'll see how much of this I remember in 5 years. That's always the, the danger with studying, huh? Um, so yeah, maybe I'll just talk briefly, I guess, about my enjoyment of this series so far. So I'm committed to finishing this off at this point. I've now checked all the books out of the library. I've returned the first couple volumes back to the library because I'm done with them, and I don't want to be a bad library patron by keeping them longer than I need to. But I've over the past couple days, I've gone and I've checked out everything so that nobody else will check out any of these volumes, or I'm still reading the series. So I'm committed to finishing this. Um, like I said, this is something I started to read 20 years ago and then just didn't stick through with. So this time, by golly, I am going to finish the whole thing. But, but I don't know how many people finish the whole thing. I feel like it's a little bit difficult to stick through this with the whole thing. I mean, it's a comic book, so comic books are easy to read. So you've got that going with it. But like I said, like I've been saying, the emotions that this is meant to hit just seem a little bit weird. The dark stuff met with the silly stuff. It seems like the emotional beats are all wrong. Plus, the story seems to be meandering. When I first started this series and I was looking at all these different characters that were being set up in volume one, I thought, oh, okay, this is going to turn out to be a really complex story. But in a lot of ways, it's just a really meandering story. I mean, the Buddha's journeying around here and there. He's meeting different people. He's not so much resolving conflicts as just repeating them a lot. So, for example, he meets up with Tata, who he had been a character in volumes 1 and 2. And in volume 2, there was this conflict where Tata wanted Buddha to be a military leader, Siddhartha. And Siddhartha didn't want to do it. And that one just seems to get repeated over here. We are still not yet at this point where he reaches the enlightenment sitting under the tree, although I think that must be what's happening in book 4 because it gets perfectly set up here at the end of book 3. But yeah, it just seems to be a very meandering and somewhat repetitive story. We'll see how my opinions evolve on this as I stick through the series, and hopefully by the time I finish it, maybe I'll have thought out some more sophisticated thoughts on it. But that's where I'm at right now. All right, I'll wrap this up for now, and then I'll be back with part 4 at some point.